Welcome to this Economist Impact Insight Hour, entitled From Bench to Bedside, Accelerating Progress in Healthcare Innovations. This is sponsored by LifeArc. So, health systems are facing many pressures, we all know this, including ageing populations, increasing non-communicable diseases, and tightening budgets. All of these pressures create a necessity to identify innovations in diagnostics, treatments, and medical technologies. But how do we make these ideas into a reality? How can we get the relevant stakeholders in the health ecosystem to collaborate to improve and accelerate the search for better outcomes and even cures? The speakers in this Insight Hour will discuss how to identify the most innovative ideas and support the research and development activities that ultimately could change patients' lives. They'll share their experience and ideas about how to take promising ideas from the bench to the bedside, and also share thoughts on how to de-risk investments and make them more appealing. So our speakers today are Luc Duché, Managing Director at Droya Ventures, Stefan Majkowski, Interim Chief Executive at LifeArc, Josefa Domingos, President of Parkinson's Europe, and Cosima Gretton, Deputy Chief Medical Officer and Executive Director of Digital Health at Future Health. So we're really interested today in looking at how we take some of these innovative ideas and make them into practice and really get some impact for patients and people in the real world. So let's start with the beginning really then. How do we discover these potential solutions and how do we link those up to unmet clinical needs? I'd like to turn first to you, Luke, if you'd like to add something here, please.
Thank you, Ali. Of course, it starts with all the great scientists we have out there, all the great academic institutes, that are working hard day on day to unravel new insights into biology, to link it to the diseases, and hopefully come up with new ideas that one day we might turn into solutions for patients. So I think a strong academic network is essential for future innovation, but obviously that on itself is not enough. It needs to be linked to clinical reality, to gathering enough data about diseases, making diseases known, and capturing all the things that are important for patients in that disease, and then hopefully find the magical match between the two so that we can give patients a better life. So in a short answer, I think that's where it starts, but there's of course much more to it.
Yeah, of course. And you've laid out some of the key actors there. Stefan, I wanted to turn to you as well. I know that in the past you've been involved as a sort of a grant holder and someone who's been distributing research grants and things. What are your thoughts on how we get this initial discovery phase sort of started?
Yes, well, I think a couple of thoughts. First of all, it's important that there is a really good understanding of the potential of scientific discoveries that are ripe for translation, that can lead to improvements for patient lives. And so having, for example, clinicians involved in some of the research activities who can bring to the research those matters which are important at the bedside of patients is one factor. The other thing is making sure that there is, as Luc mentioned, the network, also a good translation network, people who can see what the opportunities are going to be and effectively allow this translatable research to be taken to the next stage. That's one of the things we do at LifeArc, really helping de-risk some of the scientific discoveries and make them really ripe for translation.
Maybe quickly to add on that, of course, how do we finance all of that is certainly something that we also should discuss in this panel discussion. And so it's a combination of government, private initiatives like, myself with a venture capital firm, and then other institutes like LifeArc. So I think for today's panel discussion, I think it's important that we touch upon how do we finance all of this very actively as well.
The financing is a really important point there. And actually, Stefan, you mentioned de-risking. And I was just wondering if you could go into that a little bit more, just in case any of our audience either aren't very familiar with it as a concept or would like to know what it means in this context in particular.
Yes, well, very often at scientific discovery level, when something is ready to be published, it requires some what we call pre-seed funding to take the science the extra mile and really test it, make sure that it is something that is investable. At every stage of the pipeline, and in fact, you've got a growing need for funding, and it's important that organisation like Luke's and others have the ability to put funding where there is enough probability of success, and so de-risking the science, allows a better chance of funding at a later stage.
Thanks very much for that explanation there. That was really helpful. And Cosima, that was something that I wanted to ask you about related to that. I know you've done a lot of work with startups and things like that in the past. And I was just wondering your perspective here as well in terms of how we identify these potential opportunities, and also your ideas around sort of how we can link that to what health systems are looking at as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts, I guess. One of the things that I've seen particularly is that certain technologies developed inside academia or within the R&D space sometimes tend to not quite know where their problem is. And so I've, helped and been involved with various startups who have a technology, but it's really looking for a solution. And so I think rapid engagement with clinical staff, as Stefan said, but also with the patient need. I think one of the really important things is there's a lot of areas of need that don't get researched that would make patients' lives a lot better, but aren't necessarily, top of the radar from a clinical point of view. But the main thing as well, I think, is also the difference between translational research from within industry versus from within academia as a spin out into a startup. And there are a number of challenges on that front, which I think would be very interesting to talk about, just in terms of the technology readiness, the de-risking, but also the team and the person who's invented it and their readiness and ability to support that technology leaving the university is another really important factor.
That is a really interesting point, actually, because we do see so many of the large sort of academic institutions have these spin-off programs and these opportunities to take the research out into practice. I wonder if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more before we move on to another speaker.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I've had experiences where you have technologies that look like they're ready, available and promoted by tech transfer offices that are either at a lower technology readiness level than is actually truly ready to be commercialized, and so probably need additional funding and additional development inside the university, or have been kind of invented by someone who's at a certain stage of their career, which means they're struggling to leave. So I'm not an academic, but my kind of understanding from that was that it's often, there's differences between leaving to spin out as a postdoc versus as a professor versus in the mid-career. And so I think that was one of the really interesting dynamics to do with the success of a spin out that I hadn't really considered before, and ended up with some of those technologies kind of staying within the university and perhaps missing their opportunity.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's just another sort of dynamic there. So it's sort of the dynamics within the different stakeholders that we're going to be talking about a lot during this discussion. And actually, Cosima, you touched on patients, which I'd like to bring Josefa into the conversation now here, because I think that's something that's really important here is about identifying those unmet needs, but those needs that are relevant to patients. So working in a patient organisation as you do, I wondered what your perspective was here.
Yeah, I think I'd start off by saying I'm always intrigued about, I also do research, And I'm always intrigued about where we get our research questions, especially at the academia. So where is research being done and how do people actually get the questions? Because the more relevant the question will be for the person, the patient, it's the more the adherence and the outcomes we're going to have, right? So this, when we're talking about patient organizations, I think it is the place to go because it's the voices of the people, of the patients, right? So that means we have the responsibility to gather those needs, to organize them with the patients. And then not only, we should also be able to get them to the right places. So I see an additional role where we should be in contact with where research is being done in each country and then say, we have a list of needs if you're able to research them better. So that means we are, contributing maybe to influencing what is actually being used. And when we talk about patient voices, just basically maybe we should be investing in what really matters to the person with the patients. I'm sorry, I keep saying persons because we usually use persons with Parkinson. I work in Parkinson, so. But in general, I think in any neurologic disease and diseases, it's really getting that patient voice in at the right time, and I think throughout the whole process. Because if we focus on research, the more involved the person and the patients are right from the get-go, the protocols will be more adequate. Even the analysis of the results could have a different look if it's coming from a patient. I'll share a quick story with you. I was involved in a research project where we came together. We had a group of people with Parkinson, and we had a group of researchers, and we also had the engineers because the goal was to develop sensors that you put around your wrists and you would assess certain outcomes. And we all came together to try to decide which outcomes would be relevant for us to measure. And so this experience was interesting because from the clinician's point of view and the researchers, we had this focus on rigidity, on slowness of movement, on tremor. And then when we go and look at the outcomes that the patients were giving us, it seems like we were talking about another disease because totally different in terms of sleep problems, cognition. So you can see it's like if you have this mismatch, and then on the other hand, you have the engineers that were looking at us and thinking, okay, what is possible? So of course you have to have a balance about what is possible to measure versus what matters. The closer we can get to having that balance, the better outcomes the project will have.
You've made a great point there about the need for these patient relevant outcome measures. So making sure that we're thinking about what matters to people rather than just what we can measure and what we do measure routinely, but actually really giving some thought to that. Stefan, did you want to add something here?
Yes, no, what Joseph has said is really interesting. And I think, not only you need to listen to the patient voice right from the start, and you need to have patient representation really as part of the stakeholders you're talking to at any point. But I think it's very important when you're looking at translating a scientific discovery to think about the patient journey. So understand, in some cases, the key thing is diagnosis. It's not always, depending on the disease, it's not always obvious to get diagnosed in the first place. So that, you can have a big focus on diagnosis. Then after diagnosis, it's the treatment phase. And after that, it's living with the disease in certain, of course it changes disease by disease, but understanding that patient journey is really critical, and understanding how you can get the product, whether it's a diagnostic, whether it's a piece of technology, as Joseph had just mentioned, or whether it's a drug, a therapeutic, understanding how you can get it to the patient, that is a critical part of translating the invention.
That's such an important point, not just thinking about the patient relevant outcome measures, but also thinking about where in that patient journey the innovation is needed. You're absolutely right. Cosima, could I bring you in here as well, please?
Yeah, I think just to build on this, the other thing that's really interesting to think about and important for certain types of innovation, I particularly work in diagnostics, is how the person using it thinks. So I've worked for two organizations where the underlying technology was absolutely incredible, state of the art, had actually, been very impactful in other areas, in other indications. But there's a lack of understanding of how the clinicians thought through the problem and at what point the technology was going to be used and that decision-making process. And what that meant was that it was very hard for those doctors to adopt it because it didn't fit into their typical diagnostic workflow. And it's not just about necessarily where does it fit in the care pathway, but it's also where does it fit in the process of differential diagnosis, in the process of, being judicious with resources. So the example I'm thinking was a very, very expensive test that was trying to compete with, that was basically, I won't mention it just so I don't mention the company, but it was a very expensive test that was trying to compete with a series of smaller tests, and didn't really kind of realize that actually the clinician's expertise was all about carefully picking which one of those smaller tests rather than doing one large test that contained everything in it. And obviously it seemed like a great idea, put everything in one test, and that's going to do them all at once, get to the answer quicker. But actually, doctors are trained to figure out which test to do and to do just that one. So I think understanding the psychology as well as the care pathway of the people using the test, on top of also obviously the patient experience, is really important.
That's a great point, and I think really unpicking that journey as well, and that workflow and everything, because you're exactly right. Even if we've got a great technology, if it just doesn't fit into that workflow, then it's going to be really hard to implement. And that's the time when we start thinking about sort of resistance to adopting innovative technologies, etc. And it's not necessarily resistance. It can just be that it just doesn't feel like it works, and it doesn't necessarily feel like it brings an obvious benefit to people. Luke, I wondered if I could bring you in here with your experience sort of working on the VC side of this.
Yeah, and before I was a VC, I obviously was an entrepreneur, and so I started a few companies, and so I can relate to a few comments that were made here. I can agree and I can disagree on a few things, which is always good in a panel discussion. So first, to agree on, I think, finding the right match between scientific innovation, which looks like a great idea, fantastic technology, but then indeed fitting it into the ultimate, treatment journey is essential. In my first company, we developed a product for cartilage repair, which was phenomenal, but quite complicated with a complicated surgery. And the benefit over, what people were using to date was only, I would say, going to be visible 10 years down the road. So if you're 30 years, you wouldn't see a difference. And with the old therapy, you would be back, around on the street walking in let's say 3 months, whereas maybe 10 years down the road, it's not a durable reparation. Whereas with our therapy, which was scientifically great, we went all the way, did clinical trials on it. But, unfortunately it was 1 year of therapy, and then the result or the difference with the current therapy would only be visible 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road. And so it was a fantastic scientific product. I think ultimately it was also the better product. But commercially, once we made it to the market, and after, 7 or 8 years of heavy investing and raising a lot of money, it turned out that nor the patients nor the physicians were willing to use it. So you have a great product, but you have no user base. So I can, from a personal experience, I can tell this story to, I would say, underline what my colleague speakers have said here. I also agree with what you said, Josefa, that the patient voice is very important. And again, how a patient or a person with a certain disease thinks is different than how sometimes we think that don't suffer from that condition. I was most shocked once when, a 15-year-old boy told me, who was suffering from Duchenne, a muscle disease, "Luke, walking is overrated. I just want to keep using my fingers and arms to be able to control my laptop and to communicate by phone. Walking was always tough for me. I was always falling, and now I'm in a wheelchair. I'm used to it. I can get around. I feel much more independent. So walking is overrated," which I'm a quite active guy. So for me, that was probably the most shocking statement I've heard. Uh, on the other hand, that's where I agree with you, Joseph. On the other hand, of course, there's also a lot of variability between the patients, and everybody speaks from their, perspective, and so they're together under one category. But then at the end of the day, and I fully agree, everybody kind of speaks mostly, with themselves in their mind in a lot of cases, and also I've seen this where parents got involved and became very vocal, became, unrealistic, I would say, with then demands of how they could be involved by putting pressure on the company, on the regulators, on the financiers, and thereby making the case more difficult rather than more, easy. And so it's a thin line. It's a balancing act, and I fully understand that. Being a dad myself, I would do anything for my kids, but there's of course also certain rules and procedures you have to follow. There's certain things and certain limitations in drug development that you face. And so how do patients with a strong personal, interest, and sometimes a very acute direct interest, if it's a progressive disease, how do they fit in there? And so also curious to hear your thoughts on that part. So I agree, but with a little critical note on how far can we push this and how far should we go?
I wanted to add in something like, even when we get it right, or we think we got it right, which means imagine we have a sensor, which we do right now, to measure sleep, right? So different parameters of sleep. And we put these on the patients, and in the morning they look at it, and before they look at it, they think, oh, I had such a bad sleep. Let me check my sleep. So they look at it and it's like, but it says here that I slept 8 hours. So when this mismatch happens and that patient goes to the doctor and he says, I'm having sleep issues, but this thing says I'm not. And what I'm curious is which data, or who is the doctor going to treat? Is it their objective data, or is it what the person's saying? So even if we do get it right, we're going to have a new problem, which is this often in research, we see this a lot, like subjective outcomes versus objective. So we're all looking for these sensors that give objective data. But the truth is, in the clinic, I'm pretty sure the doctor is going to choose what the patient's saying before they look at the sensor. So that's just a thought.
I think that's a great point, especially as we do lead more towards a lot of these sort of wearables and things like that we can take data from. I know as someone with 2 still quite small children that I don't always trust what my watch tells me in terms of how much sleep I've got, certainly. But Josepha, I was also wondering there if you could pick up on the point Luke made about the sort of variation in the patient perspective, because it's important here, isn't it, not to just generalize and say, the patient perspective is X and this is the single outcome measure that matters most to patients as a single entity. So working as you do in a patient organization, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think, more and more we hear this term of personalized care, and it's just every person is so individual that we have to find a way to be able to group and organize. When I said previously, organize these needs, because I'm sure everyone understands that at a society level, we need to get interventions or treatments that are cost effective. So we have to pinpoint these needs in order to be able to move forward with actions. So I think it's really about doing these, and this is where the research is very important, even in the associations, which is identifying the needs using more rigorous methods so that we can really group these needs, right? So if I ask all people with Parkinson, like, okay, what is your number one need? I'm pretty sure everyone's going to answer, I want the cure, right? Okay. Now, besides the cure, which is that one is global, I doubt that everything else that's coming in will be something that will be the same, right? So that means for some people is getting, the right information. And then what does that mean? What is the right information? The right information at the right time of the disease. If I give too much information in someone that just got diagnosed, maybe that's going to do more harm than good. But how do we choose? So, and I don't think we have an easy answer, but we do group needs into, educational needs, maybe research needs, involvement, engagement. In terms of health, I think associations as well, identifying, how does community interventions would be like or either community exercise or activities that might bring also better health outcomes. Being very objective is like we need just to use more rigorous methods to be able to identify those needs so that we can be sure that we are. And that means including the patient's voices, obviously.
Of course, and I know within your organisation, for example, you've got a group specialising in representing the needs of young people with Parkinson's as well. So you are sort of trying to disaggregate that patient population to provide more tailored advocacy and etc. Cosima, I mean, obviously working for the largest study in the UK to date, you've got a lot of patient perspectives to think about there in terms of sort of the things that you're looking at there. What's your perspective here in terms of sort of taking the patient from that amorphous concept to sort of the more individual?
Yes, it's a very relevant topic. So essentially, at Our Future Health, we will be soon, I think, one of the largest research programs in the UK. We've just passed 1.7 million registered and over 500,000 fully genotyped with questionnaire data in a full blood sample. So we're on track and progressing really fast. And one of the main priorities is about recruiting a fully diverse cohort. So that's both different geographical distributions, socioeconomic status and ethnicity. And with that, and with the fact that we're recruiting healthy volunteers who may or may not develop certain diseases, who may have certain predispositions, comes with it a huge variation in interests and needs. And so while we are a research cohort, we're going to be enabling further studies. And some of those studies are data studies, of which there could be infinite. So there's not necessarily kind of as many challenges with how we select and prioritize. Where we are going to need to really think about this in earnest, and this is work to be done, is where we're enabling studies, what we call recontact studies. So these are recall studies whereby researchers can go out to our cohort and ask certain people with certain predispositions, for example, to take part in a study. And that might be, you might already have a diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, and our data shows that you have a certain gene that predisposes you to an adverse reaction to a drug. A company might want to recruit you for that. Or you might just have a diagnosis of diabetes, something quite simple. So the challenge with that is that we can't enable, infinite studies for that. And so it's about thinking about what are the priorities there. And one of the things that we're heavily investing in over the last 6 months, as we start to think about this work, is our public and participant engagement program. So we've got a series of programs, a series of projects ongoing to go out to the community, to both public and our participants, to talk about these topics. I don't have a clear answer on how we select and prioritize these issues. It's going to be very complicated, but it is definitely something that we acutely feel the need to focus on in the next 6 months to a year.
That's a very important point, actually, because one of the things is that here, I think I wouldn't dispute in any sense that it's very, very important, obviously, that we have patients involved. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are some patient organisations and some health conditions that are much better sort of set up in terms of the patient organisations that are within those spaces, their sort of experience of providing advocacy, but also their links to funding. So there are some large patient organisations that are able to part fund research, whereas there are some that are much smaller and less able to partake in that as much. So I wondered, Stefan, if I could bring you in here to sort of start to think about collaboration more broadly, but really sort of how do we make sure that that patient involvement is sort of fair and we're not just sort of favouring the loudest voices and the most powerful voices?
I think to a great extent it's involving a broad range of stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders in the discussion, and the patient voice is one of them. But as as Luke mentioned, sometimes it will vary from patient to patient what the main issue is. So I think patient associations from that point of view are incredibly useful because they can present and represent really a number of voices from patients directly. But clinicians obviously are absolutely key. And then, having a good understanding of the path to the patient. I should also say that, we do some work in low and middle income countries where circumstances can be very different from those we know in the Western world. So it also depends on where, the need is, where the patient is. And you have to take into account, the whole pathway, the ease to which you can get, products to the patient. So you may have, for example, something which is, a wonderful therapy, but if it requires getting it, keeping the therapeutic at minus 80 degrees and transporting it to patients which live in far corners, that can become a major obstacle and make the whole cost just unaffordable. So there are so many things to think about that collaborations, and I'm getting to the answer to your question, and collaborations can be incredibly useful because you are bringing various expertise together. It's impossible for one single organization to be able to have all the answers. Fully integrated companies and can provide, from the scientific discovery right to patient delivery is almost unheard of. So collaborations where you've got world-class expertise in particular fields which allow multidisciplinary collaboration is, I think, is the future. And whether it is, academia, the patient voice, funding is critical. Charities can play an enormous role, and the collaboration of all of those is, I think, the path forward. Now, the more stakeholders you have, the more difficult it is to come to a common agreement. But I think you have to start with agreeing on what outcome you're trying to reach. And from that, you can really build together a partnership with the relevant people. I think, the more I look into how to come across unmet medical need and then tackle it, collaborations is the obvious path forward. And I think there are some really, really great things happening in the life science sector. There is, it takes time, but little by little, I think there is a breakdown of the silos that used to exist. The UK in particular was very well known in the past for being absolutely first class at research, for example, but not so good at bringing the scientific discoveries to the patients. So integration, the breakdown of silos and partnerships is a way to accelerate that path to the patient. And I'll add one final thing, which is as you progress your discovery through the pipeline, it's really important to understand who can take it to the next stage. So, for example, at LifeArc, we're funding a clinical trial in cell therapy, which will allow, hopefully, if all goes well, first in human, another group to take it forward to phase 2. So you need to think forward and look at possible partnerships, not only for the current challenge, but the next one down the pipeline.
Yeah, you've made some really, really good points there about the need for that stakeholder web almost of all of those different stakeholders that need to be involved, and also just acknowledging the limitations, well, not limitations, but the constraints of any one organisation in terms of how far they can take a technology. And I wanted to start sort of talking about that broader collaboration here as well. So Luke, I wanted to bring you in at this point in terms of sort of how do you sort of manage working with a variety of different stakeholders in collaboration? Especially, I'm interested in potentially how do you sort of balance cooperation and competition in particular?
It's a good question, Ali, and it's not an easy answer as we know. Obviously, I fully agree with what Stefan said. Collaboration is key, partnerships are key, and should lead to a better outcome. Unfortunately, sometimes it's complicated because the more parties you bring together, the more complex the relationship becomes. And just to give one example, about my Duchenne work, for example. We were a small biotech partnering with a large pharma company. We were working very closely with the patient groups and directly with patients. But as a big pharma company, there were, a large number of rules. Direct interaction between a pharma company and patients could be seen as, commercializing or marketing or pre-commercializing. The company, in say had a large fine, and so they pushed the regulations a bit too far and were, shying away from any contact with patients. So the relationship we had built for a long time, the involvement we had with patients, we needed to partner with a large pharma to do a large study, to do a global study, to be able to do that study, not only in Belgium and the Netherlands, but also in the UK, also in the US, also in Canada, also in South America. And that was something that was, way above, or I would say, that was boxing above our weight if we wanted to do that by ourselves. So we partnered, which we thought was a good idea, more financial means, more human resources to do that. But then the proximity to the patient was kind of swept away because of different rules in a pharma company. And I think this shows the complexity that we have, that it's very hard to get to a partnership that is workable for everybody. And that's just one example. On the other hand, even within the patient organizations, I agree, in a lot of these small rare disorders, it's important to at least have one group, and you're happy if there's already one group of patients, organizing themselves. But then after a while in Duchenne, we saw that there was more and more, money flowing towards Duchenne. Also, the patient groups, started to almost compete for money and attention with the different players amongst themselves. And so at the end of the day, it became almost counterproductive, where you had, patient group A supporting biotech A, patient group B supporting biotech group B, whereas there was so much that we actually had in common, and it was a fight against the disease and not a fight against each other's. And so that was an interesting dynamic that I never thought that I would see, but it happened. I think ultimately the result is good. It's always better to have more publicity, even if it's sometimes a bit of fights and negative publicity, than no publicity for a certain disease. Ultimately, that will kind of push the industry towards a solution. But it was a very awkward and bizarre experience to be in the midst of that, because we were trying to do good for patients ultimately, but on the one hand we had patients cheering for us, or a certain group cheering for us, and other groups actually pushing somebody else and thereby badmouthing some of the stuff we were doing. So I think, as with everything, partnerships are complex, so there is no easy answer on how partnerships accelerate things. But the one thing I know for sure, it's better to have them than not to have them. On your own, you're on your own. And so there's no magical solution. It's on a case-by-case example that you have to work through it. But I think all stakeholders are very important. So I fully echo what Stefan said. Partnerships are the key to success. And also with partnerships, often are a good, I would say, marketing gimmick almost, to attract more funding. If something is highlighted, something gets into the press, people like to talk about, partnerships, big collaborations, that attracts more attention. And so it becomes a self, almost a self reinforcing kind of effort. And I think ultimately that's what we need. So fully agree that partnerships are key to success, But, a little nuance that it's also, as with anything, any relationship is complex. And in partnerships, and certainly when there's health at stake, it's even more complex.
Yeah, agreed. And I think also you've really highlighted there well in terms of how it can be really difficult to align the priorities of these different stakeholders. And inevitably there can be tensions and things like that. But it's ultimately in how you manage that. It's not about being able to completely eliminate that as something that may occur. It's just how you manage it. And I wanted to bring you in here, Cosima, about because you're obviously managing a lot of different stakeholders, but I also wanted to start to think about potentially how people working in R&D could be working perhaps closer with health systems. So thinking in particular about regulators, how could we start to see some of those partnerships and sort of collaborations working a little bit better to help to bring things from research into practice?
I think that's a great question. There are already some great initiatives ongoing for that. I mean, obviously, Our Future Health is aiming to be one of those, which is to start to think about our focus is actually exclusively at the moment on really focusing on translational research, things that are close to being able to be brought into practice and actually doing those final stages of evaluation of things like clinical utility, cost effectiveness. But also we're focused on prevention as well. So that's the other area that's kind of narrowing down our focus, is to say, let's do things that are kind of going to have a broader impact upstream. But so as an organization, we work with many different stakeholders, as you mentioned, both from very small to very large, from academic to industry. And we do set up collaborations and partnerships, and that will be a very core part of our success in the future, is bringing those people together. But there are already outside Our Future Health a number of initiatives that are the NIHR biomedical research councils bring together clinicians and academia, and often combine hospitals and research centres around a specific subject, and are able to recruit patients with specific conditions. So that's, I think, a really good example in the UK of where we are doing that very successfully. There's also increasing effort from the MHRA to start to work with industry, and I know they're looking at kind of innovative devices, accelerator pathways, where they can actually work with people in industry at a really early stage to start to help shape both their product design and also their application to support success in areas where they see the need. But I think the other thing that I think is also really important is I don't see yet enough. I see pockets of clinicians working with researchers. I don't see enough health system kind of setting the priorities and requirements externally to developers. So what I mean by that is entities like UKHSA and OHID or NHS England, there are needs within the health system, and there is obviously procurement pathways, and they have things on frameworks, and they say we need these things. But those are often quite downstream of the kind of innovation journey. And so, I've been in conversations about how do we better create that communication where across all kinds of areas of innovation, pharma, life sciences, diagnostics, the need from government, public health, the health system is better communicated to industry, so we can co-design things and bring them together. And I was at a talk by Jonathan Van Tam where he said just this, and I think it's really, really important because it helps address that challenge where you've got everyone working kind of in silos with their own definition of the problem, and then when it gets to the rubber hits the road, it doesn't quite fit. So I think there's opportunity there as well.
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of thinking about how health systems could be a bit more proactive in terms of setting that agenda rather than sort of it almost happening in isolation of what's going on in the R&D world. That's a really good suggestion there. And actually something that you talked about earlier, Cosima, was about the data that you're generating within Our Future Health. And this is something also that Luke mentioned in terms of making sure that we're gathering enough data about diseases. And I wanted to talk to you all about patient data? Because obviously that's something that's a massively valuable commodity in the modern world. And sort of thinking about how do we balance sort of privacy and legitimate concerns about that, whilst also making sure that we're really facilitating the maximum use from the data that we're collecting and things like that. So I wanted to turn to you, Josefa, first, just to see your perspective in terms of when you're communicating with patients, you know, what are you doing in terms of sort of providing them with reassurance about how their data is going to be used, and what's your sort of general sense of patients' understanding of how their data will be used in sort of research and things?
I'll say if I'm being part, so I do research in the clinic, which means whatever intervention I'm doing, I also try to add in a research perspective. So if it is for imagine a randomized controlled trial, there's certain protocols that we have to go through. And what's intriguing to me, it's like, why wouldn't we as clinicians follow the same? So the closer we can get to these two being the same, we will probably reduce efforts down the road. So that I think it's a great advantage to be clinician and researcher at the same time. I think because it helps me have more critical thinking about the outcome measures that I'm actually using or the data that I'm collecting. And I wanted to add in something that it's not only like privacy, but the quantity of data that we are gathering and then what we actually do with it. And the perspective is like in research is the more I get, then maybe I will find something more, right? So it's more so that we can find different questions and then in the clinical aspect, I just need enough to be able to guide my practice. So there is a clear difference for the goal of which I'm collecting the data, and of course assuring the patients that normal considerations of privacy of where their data is collected, if it's electronic or not, in what type of format. But my concerns is more, I think we have that nicely outlined at this moment. But the next step is like, what am I doing with all that data? And the at least at the Parkinson patient associations and other patient associations, the patients tend to participate in several research studies. So that means, and then you have always the baseline assessments that you're going to do. So they might be participating in 3-4 studies in the same month where the research will be doing exactly the same outcome measures and tests. And no one is actually thinking about that. It's like, that doesn't make sense. If I do a cognitive assessment, I'm supposed to wait 6 months before I do that test again. But no one asks, are you participating in another research study when they... So I think there's still issues about how much quantity are we actually collecting. If it makes sense, then I hope that in terms of privacy, everyone is, just obliging by what we already know that should be done.
I think actually what you've pointed out there, Josefa, is the need for sort of collaboration and potentially ways in which we could share that sort of data so that we didn't have that duplication of effort and that unnecessary replication there. But I wanted to bring in Stefan here actually to talk about the sort of the logistics of sharing data and things like that. How do we make sure, as Josefa's outlined, that we're not just gathering more and more, but we're gathering better data and we're making sure that we're getting everything that we need from it?
Yeah, I think the potential of clinical data is absolutely huge. Patient data, clinical data, and with technology advancing at a fast pace, there is more and more data available. And we need to be able to use the tools to analyze this data and make as much sense from it as we can. So, there is enormous data produced by, for example, imaging equipment coming from, the clinic or research institutes. That's one thing. And then there's, all the work that, for example, Cosima's organization, Our Future Health, are doing in terms of, patient genetic information and other information. So I think it would make a lot of sense to try and have tools that allow us to do the the analysis, whether it's the infrastructure, shared infrastructure. This is something that the physics world do very, very well, and I think life sciences should follow that example and have big investments in the right infrastructure. And then, of course, artificial intelligence tools. As I said, the potential is huge. There's a lot of hurdles you have to go through. You have to be very careful at patient consent and how the information is used. Not just once, but multiple times down the line. And I think this is an area which is where there is a lot of progress to be made. But one way I think a number of organisations, whether it's government funded or whether it's charity funded, can really make a difference. So I think this is definitely something which requires a lot of investment to maximise the potential of the data we're gathering.
Thanks, Stefan. And you and I both mentioning our future health means that it's only polite to bring Cosima in here if you want to add something to what Stefan was saying there.
Yeah, lots of very important points. I guess I'll start with why so much data, because it's a really important question. There's a few reasons. Some of them are kind of so I guess one of the first is to say that there are certain groups, certain communities, and certain people with certain conditions who often don't get represented in the research because either it is hard to recruit enough people with that condition because it's rare, or for certain ethnic minorities, perhaps they're not represented in the data, and that means they're not represented in how whether the drug or the treatment works, and therefore the efficacy of the treatment down the line. So one of the reasons why our future health is so big is to make sure that we actually encourage recruitment of those individuals and we're fully representative. The other reason, to build on Stefan's point, is that there are new technologies now that rely on large data sets to produce insights. But also coming back to the kind of rarer condition question, we're also, because it's a longitudinal study over the next kind of 20, 30 years, what we're really interested in, and we're really focused on prevention and early detection. What we're really interested in is recruiting healthy volunteers at this point, and we store a blood sample, and that person may, in 5-10 years' time, develop a condition, say Parkinson's, and we'll be able to go back to that blood sample and analyze whether there's something different about that blood sample. And you need to recruit a lot of people in order to capture that particular situation. So that's a bit about why so much data. And on the security question, there's a lot of progress being made here in this space, actually across the industry, about how we enable access to data. So the way we're doing it at our Future Health and the way that it's happening in the NHS and I think in the US is this concept of secure data environments or trusted research environments, whereby the data is, we have genotyping data, health record data, questionnaire data, and that all comes together into our secure environment, and then researchers apply for access to that environment. And so in that context, and as well, it's really important to say that all identifiers are removed from the data before it goes into that environment. And so the people, anyone accessing it needs to be from an approved institution, for an approved use case, and there's strict controls over what they can and can't take out. And so there are lots of new ways to enable research on these large data sets that are anonymized without having data be transferred and without identification. So I think there's been some really good progress on that front. Hand over to Luke.
Yeah, I think the question I have on that, Cosima, is almost, how do we then deal and distribute, or how do we think about value being generated out of these data? I think we all agree that collecting data is important. If I would be a patient or just a healthy volunteer, I would be fine if I donate my data that they will be used. That's what I want. I don't want them to be stored in a large database and just to sit there. But then the question that we often face is, if we use the data and who can kind of make money on the data, I would say is I think the more sensitive question. So curious to hear people's thought on that. I'm obviously, coming out of for profit. So I think if people invest and do an effort, they can make some money on it. And if it contributes to the bigger goal, which is ultimately preventing or curing diseases, I'm perfectly fine that people make money on it. But making money out of patient data is a very sensitive topic, and I'm familiar. So curious to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. It is a very sensitive topic and a question we get asked a lot. I think the first thing to say is that Our Future Health is a charity. So we're a non-profit, so everything, any revenue we make goes back into the business. And at the moment, we're funded from government and from life sciences. But the long-term goal is to be sustainable. And what that means is that we will be charging for access to the data. And obviously, that has with it some sensitivities. But I think one of the important points to make is that actually, if we didn't, we'd continue to take government funding, which actually isn't necessarily fair, because I think that's double both patient data and the taxpayers' money. So I think there is an important point to make here about the model, which is that, yes, we will be charging for access to the data. No, we won't be selling the data to anyone. There's no distribution of the data. But that money and the profit derived from perhaps that business goes back into enriching the data set and supporting further research and driving further patient benefit. And so I see it as actually, Luke, to your point, when an organization makes a profit, it means that they've been successful and they've got something that's actually having an impact in this space. And equally, if we support successful endeavors, the organization continues and we can continue to invest in the data set.
But I think, sorry to add on, but just for this discussion, I'm then curious if I want to start a database, and I raise some money, we almost could become competitors who both provide access. And so I think this is also where there is a balancing act, because at the end of the day, we want to collect most data and then use the data in the right way. But on the other end, you do see that, people do pay a lot of money for access to the right data because that helps them in their specific efforts. And so I'm still struggling what the right answer is. I think it's important that these efforts exist, but I think the whole value creation, value capturing around data is certainly a topic that will be important in the future of our health, and something that we'll have more discussions about. But I think there's certainly a lot of alignment, but also still a lot of questions and potential conflicts ahead of us there.
I'll say one last thing. I think that's a great point. There are increasing data sets, and I think it will come down to patient trust, because if there are many options for where you could provide consent for your data to be accessed, it will be something people are increasingly aware and concerned about privacy. And so I think people will, the competition will be in the space of who can provide the most secure and the best use of that data. I think that would be the differentiator.
Thanks. I think that was a great discussion in terms of sort of underlying some of the key problems here in terms of making sure that we're generating value, but also thinking about the competition versus collaboration sort of components here, and also just thinking exactly as Luke described there, making sure that we're thinking in a way that is focused on outcomes and the common goals that we talked about earlier, not just thinking about sort of falling into easy stereotypes about which sector the developer is working in, etc. Stefan, I wanted to come to you to see if you've got anything to add here as well, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention on this point the importance of the how this is viewed from the general public, because sometimes you can have effectively the science really ahead of the general opinion, and for organisations like Cosima's, it's really important that the public is engaged and willing to cooperate, and so you do have to have some safeguards. If suddenly and there have been stories like this in the past, the data gets in the hands of insurers, the public will lose faith, and it's really important to get public engagement, throughout this important part. I mean, as Cosmo said, it's we're talking about 20, 30 years of using the data, and so reputation is, I think, a very, very important thing to safeguard. I remember years ago, golden rice and this work which was done, which could really have improved the lives of patients, and the general public were not behind it. And so it's important to make sure that the public engagement is maintained throughout, and that there is confidence. And that's why, dealing with consent, trusted research environments, these are very, very important matters.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the things that's been great about the discussion today, is we've covered really well the dynamics of the R&D ecosystem here, and understanding some of the key stakeholders and how they can all come together to work better, to develop innovations, but also to try to bring them into practice as well. Because I think we've all agreed here that it's not just about having the ideas, it's about making the difference to people's lives ultimately, isn't it? So I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for taking part in this discussion. It's been really fascinating. I hope our audience has enjoyed it, and thank you to our sponsors, LifeArc.